Welcome to People, Power, and Politics. Hard talk, riveting interviews, community updates, in-depth analysis. That's People, Power, and Politics. We tell it to you as it is. No holds barred. You are the people, you have the power. We bring you the politics. To listen to our show, be a guest, or to advertise, visit www.pppradio.nyc. That's www.pppradio.nyc.
A very warm welcome to everyone. We have a very special guest, New York City Comptroller, the Honorable Brad Lander, joining us here on People, Power, and Politics. Always a pleasure, and we're always excited to have you, so welcome.
Great to be with you, Pearl. Thank you, as always, for the invitation.
Okay, so the focus of our discussion, the interview today, is the DocGo $432 million contract, as well as the right to shelter, New York City's right to shelter. So, can you elaborate on the specific qualifications and experience concerns you raised about DocGo in rejecting the $432 million contract for migrant services?
Absolutely. First, let me just take one step back and say, this New York City is the immigrant city that is a beacon to the world, and that's why we've got the Statue of Liberty in the harbor. But it also is true in every generation that immigrants come and make New York City over and over and over again. And obviously, you and your listeners and readership, are a big part of that. And it's just always hard to remind people. Sometimes people could be like, well, that was through the last generation, but now it's different. And that also has happened every time. So our collective mission is to rise to the challenge of welcoming people and helping them become the next generation of New Yorkers. And there's lots of places in New York City where that is happening beautifully, and people are getting help, getting shelter, getting help applying for asylum, getting help getting work authorizations, and becoming New Yorkers. But it's not at all clear to me that, and lots of contractors are spending billions of dollars making that happen. But this $432 million no-bid contract for DocGo, much of which is to bus people upstate without clear service pathways or support. DocGo is a medical services company that the city worked with during COVID to provide vaccination and COVID tests and medical staffing. But there's no evidence that they had any experience providing shelter or services to asylum seekers or assisting people with asylum applications or anything like that. And when the city does emergency procurement, normally we bid things out. When we say this is a no-bid contract, usually we bid out contracts and we say, do you have the qualifications and what price would you charge, and all the things we look at. But in an emergency and welcoming so many asylum seekers and providing shelter for 60,000 of them, that qualifies as a procurement emergency. But you still have to make sure you're getting contractors with the experience to do the work, and who also have the integrity and price competitiveness. And when that contract came to our office, we asked a lot of questions about it. And it's just, we did not see what their relevant experience is. They were not clear how they vetted contractors and subcontractors, and a few of their subcontractors, it turned out, who were security companies, had not gotten the proper licensing for the security guards. And so we told the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development, who had sent us the contract, that we did not believe this was an appropriate emergency contract, and that we thought that they should reconsider it and that we would not approve it.
So, Comptroller Lander, Mayor Eric Adams claims that the city had the approval from your office for emergency contracts. So, could you clarify the nature of that approval and explain why it doesn't extend to the specific approval of the DocGo contract?
Yes. So there's a number of steps in any kind of contracting, in traditional regular bid contracting, and also different steps, but a number of steps for emergency contracting. So the first, and basically they had taken two, but not the final most important third step of that. So they had asked for permission to utilize formalize emergency contracting for asylum seeker services that they had done in the summer of 2022. And we did say, yes, okay, this is an emergency and you can do asylum seeker procurement using emergency contracting. I'll be honest, we're looking at whether that big blanket permission should be narrowed and they should have to come to us for permission on each individual contract, because I think they are taking too much leeway. But we had given them permission broadly to do emergency procurement for asylum seeker shelter and services. That's step one. Step two is to give us what's called written notification or written determination for when they are moving forward with a particular contractor. And that's just one page in which they say, we're moving forward, here's the name of the contractor and the dollar volume of the contract. And they did that in June of this year for DocGo. The company actually is called Rapid Reliable. And they sent us that one piece of paper that said, we're moving forward with Rapid Reliable for $432 million. And we acknowledged receipt of that one piece of paper. But we still didn't actually have the contract. Mm-hmm. And they did not submit the contract to us until a few weeks ago. And of course, until they submit the contract to us, we can't review the contract and evaluate whether the proper procedures were followed, all the information. So when we got that, that's when we're able to look at the contract and when we reviewed it. And then once we've received that contract, then we file it in the city's financial management system, so that only at that point can a vendor submit invoices and get paid for their work. They may have already been working for months, as DocGo was, because they can start working once the city has negotiated a contract with them, but they don't get paid until we see the contract and file it in the system. So when we got the contract, that's when my team reviews it. And when we have questions and issues, we go back and forth with the agency. In every other asylum seeker contract case, there were already 70 others. We had asked our questions, they had answered our questions, and we filed the contract for payment in the system. So we had done this, we do this thousands of times a year. We had already done it for 70 other asylum seeker service contracts for shelter, for food, for security. But on this one, we asked questions, we did not get sufficient answers, and so we told HPD, we aren't going to file it in the system. We think you should not proceed with this contract. The mayor then has the power, per the city charter, essentially to overrule me, to insist that the city will move forward and pay the contractor over my objections. And I don't deny that he has the authority to do that, but it was not the case that we had already approved the contract. We hadn't even seen the contract.
So what are your thoughts on him overriding your decision and approving the contract?
Well, I think it was a mistake. I think we have, as I say, dozens and dozens of other vendors that are providing services. This is not a unique vendor. We're working with many, many others. And I think there are too many concerns about DocGo. I don't see that they have the requisite experience. I'm concerned about some of their business practices. And much more reporting has continued to reveal these kinds of problems. And I don't think the city is getting the value for taxpayer dollars in an appropriate way from this vendor. And I think so that's why we've launched an audit. We generally an audit waits until a program or a project or a contract is done. That's the way, obviously, it's like your audit. It comes at the end of the year, after the year is over. We, for the first time in my tenure, launched what is a real-time audit. And we're gonna, we've already reached out to HPD to say we want to see the invoices, and we really want to dig in and make sure everything is on the up and up and we're getting what we're paying for. And we will report to the public on what we find.
And speaking about concerns, the company is under investigation by the state's attorney generals and the governor's administration. How did these ongoing investigations influence your decision to reject the contract?
So obviously we look at all of the information when the contract gets to us. and that's part of the information. So by the time, it's interesting that the one other thing I forgot to mention, in a somewhat unusual way, as I said before, that you can't get, a vendor can't get paid until we have received and filed their contract in the system. There is a waiver which makes it possible for people to get an advance that is very rare. But the agency has to apply to our office for it. Out of the 70 emergency contracts that I mentioned, we had granted it 2 times. Once for a contract where they were trying to allow churches and mosques and synagogues to kind of get their congregation, they're ready to maybe offer some shelter, and we said, okay, that's appropriate for advance because you might need to do some work to provide a sprinkler system or a ramp to make your church more accessible. If you want to do that, okay, don't mind an advance for that. But they unusually submitted a request for an advance for DocGo, which is a publicly traded company, to get a $4 million advance. So we had denied that request before any of this, before the New York Times articles, before the Attorney General's investigation, because we just thought, I don't know, it seemed a little fishy. And my team caught that and denied it. So that was all before. But by the time we got the contract, the Times articles had come out, the Times Union articles had come out, the Attorney General's office investigation was underway, and the New York Secretary of State's investigation was underway. And so, of course, my team looked at those. And we had already flagged this concern about their process for vetting their subcontractors, which they, had not provided enough information about. But this, the concerns about their security firms that the Secretary of State and the AG are looking at really relate to that. If you don't have proper vetting systems in place and reporting on what you've done to check the integrity of your subcontractors, of course, it's much more likely that problems will emerge. So,
speaking about fishy, in your denial letter, you reference alarming news articles detailing the inflation of DocGo's in financial value. How does financial transparency play a role in evaluating and approving such contracts?
Well, obviously, when you're contracting with a vendor, you want to know that they have the financial systems and consistency and integrity in place in order to provide those, whatever the goods or services are. And that's why, part of due diligence on a contract is to get their financial information. And sometimes that's just like, okay, we want to make sure they're real and going to be around and not going to go out of business in a few minutes, and then we're going to have contracted with them. And of course, you have to be able to rely on, people are going to submit you invoices and say, here's how much we spent on X. And the agency's job will be to test it and make sure that X really was spent. But you have to have confidence in the basic systems and transparency and financial integrity of contractors, and that's true everywhere. And that's why we have some of these concerns here. Again, this is when a company that's done a different thing, that's been a medical staffing company overnight, says now we're an asylum seeker shelter company and we have the money to do this all over, except at the same time they say, but also we need a $4 million advance, and you don't have confidence in some of their transparency and reporting. That sends up the red flags about whether we're going to get what we have taxpayers on the hook to pay for.
So let's take a look at the city's right to shelter versus emergency contracts. How do you see the rejection of this contract aligning with the New York City's right to shelter, and how does it impact the city's obligation to provide shelter for asylum seekers?
Yeah, so, as I think, people might know, but I'll just say it because I think people hear right to shelter and might not kind of know a little bit of the history. Back in the 1970s, the Coalition for the Homeless and the Legal Aid Society brought a lawsuit on behalf of a homeless individual named Callahan. That's why it's called the Callahan case. And what they argued in that case was that the New York State Constitution, which says that the state will, provide for the welfare of New Yorkers, requires the city to shelter people who need it, rather than the people with sleep on the street. That if someone says, I'm homeless, I don't have a place to live, rather than sleep on the street, I would like to sleep under a roof, that the city has an obligation called the right to shelter to provide shelter for homeless individuals, and then it was extended to families. Now, it never went to trial, but the judge basically said, I'm inclined, there's a likelihood that I would find a trial that there is that right to shelter, and therefore I encourage the city, with the state at the table as well, to reach an agreement with the Callahan plaintiffs, Legal Aid and Coalition for the Homeless, to provide shelter. And the city did that. The city said, okay, judge, we understand that you're saying there's a likelihood you would find that way. And the city agreed to a consent decree, and that's where the right to shelter is founded. Now, part of what's always been confusing is, if it's in the state constitution, then it must apply statewide. If there's a right in the state constitution for right to shelter, it's a statewide right, not a New York City right. But because the consent decree was only agreed to by the city, it has only been applied in the city. Now, for most of the last 50 years, since there's been a right to shelter, we didn't have the situation where many people who were undocumented or were new arrivals, because these would come forward and seek shelter. In part, previously, folks might have been afraid that if they checked in with the city, that would lead them to being found by the federal government and potentially being subject to a deportation proceeding. But some things changed. The process of applying for asylum, you now in general present yourself at the border. And so folks who are here in this wave of asylum seekers have done that. They're proceeding legally to seek their right to safely seek asylum. The government, U.S. government, knows they're here. And so as a result of that, plus Governor Abbott's just cynical, inhumane busing of people here against their will, we welcomed them. And some folks from some of the advocacy groups said, hey, we've got right to shelter, so you don't have to sleep on the street. And that led to the right to shelter applying, or it's pretty straightforward. If you're here, if you're in New York City, you don't have to prove that you've been here a long time. You don't have to prove that you're a citizen. You have this, we have the right to be in shelter rather than sleep on the street. But that led to rapid growth of people in shelter from about 50,000 to now well over 100,000. Mm-hmm. And of course, that costs a lot of money to provide shelter for people. And it's a very big logistical challenge, because to expand your shelter system from 50,000 beds to over 100,000 beds means getting tons of new hotels and shelters. So it's a big logistical challenge, and it costs a lot of money. And that's why the mayor and the governor are essentially saying, we want to overturn the right to shelter. And they have gone into court to ask the judge to let them out of the consent decree and find that the city doesn't have that obligation. I think that would be an enormous mistake, because the right to shelter is what keeps New York from having tens of thousands of people sleeping on the street, which is how it is in many other cities, in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Seattle, where there isn't such a right. Thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, many more. I know we have some folks in New York who sleep on the street, but it's here, it's closer to 5,000, even though we have over 100,000 people in the shelter system. And if we don't have the right to shelter, I really think tens of thousands of people, and not only asylum seekers, but also longtime New Yorkers as well, would wind up sleeping on the street. And that's heartbreaking. It's of course terrible to sleep on the street for your health and your mental health. But it also is just terrible for a city to be a place that has tens of thousands of people sleeping on the street. It's not good for the economy or people's sense of their neighborhoods or just our human compassion. So I'm really opposed to this. I hope the judge will not agree to it. in the meantime, to meet the right to shelter, we do need a lot of contracts with shelter providers and service providers to meet the obligation. And for asylum seekers, especially, if we can provide some legal services to help them apply for asylum or TPS and get work authorization, they'll get jobs and move out of shelter. And spending just a little bit on legal services and case management will save a lot of money because people will be able to move out of shelter. We think providing the legal services costs a couple $1,000. Providing a year of shelter costs over $130,000. So it will be really wise to help people get out of shelter and on their feet through supports like legal services and case management. In the meantime, we need contracts to provide that shelter and services. But as I said, we have many nonprofit and other providers of shelter and services that already make up the shelter system, and some new folks are stepping up, and there's more room for involving churches and synagogues and congregations. But you still have to keep your basic attention to integrity, and you can't just use any vendor. And in this case, we have these concerns about this one that we expressed as we talked about before.
Yes. So, Controller, Councilwoman Shahana Hanif, who's also the chair of the Immigration Council in the City Council, has been vocal about her concerns regarding the Adams administration's 30-day notice policy, specifically with Intro 1212 aimed at making it unenforceable. What are your thoughts on her efforts to combat limitations on shelter stays for asylum seekers as outlined in this bill, and how do you see the role of your office in ensuring the rights and welfare of asylum seekers in New York City?
Yeah, I generally support Councilmember Honey's legislation. I hope that the judge just will not allow the end of the consent decree, because if the judge finds that there's no reason to change the consent decree, then we don't need a new law. The ones we have stand. Look, I hope the judge will say that the right to shelter found in the state constitution applies statewide, because we need more help from Albany and from other cities around the state. I know there are places, actually Buffalo has a wonderful refugee resettlement program. There are upstate cities that really have, looking for workers of the kind that these folks have skills in construction or nursing or childcare, all kinds of things. So I'd like to see it extended statewide, which is why I guess my preference would be that the judge finds that the right to shelter is indeed in the state constitution and applies statewide. That would be better than just having a city law, because it would bring the rest of the state on board in providing support and services. And look, housing is very expensive here. It's much more affordable in other parts of the state. So just having a broader set of both space and economic opportunities would be better. But in the absence of that, I think city legislation is certainly worth considering.
And finally, sir, in your statement, you mentioned the need for the city to focus on moving long-term stayers into housing and supporting new arrivals in applying for asylum. What long-term strategies do you propose for addressing the housing needs of asylum seekers in New York City?
So let's separate for this the people that are asylum seekers, new arrivals, and people that have been in the shelter system already for a long time New York residents. For that group of people, the thing I really would like to see most of all is for the state legislature to pass what are called the Housing Access Voucher Program, or HAVP, proposed by Senator Brian Kavanaugh. That I thought there was broad agreement, but Albany just didn't get to it during their spring session. And that would create tens of thousands of housing vouchers available to people who are either homeless or facing homelessness, to help them get affordable housing, and we really, really need that. For asylum seekers, I actually think, as I said before, that if we can provide people help now filling out their asylum applications or their TPS paperwork and their work authorizations, that many of them will get jobs and will be able to move out of shelter without needing a housing voucher or a long-term housing subsidy, that we can then focus on folks who are more long-term stayers. You know, these are folks who, because they love their kids and believe in their future so much, walked across a continent and through a jungle, and overwhelmingly they want to get jobs and work in ways that will enable them to support their families and pay their rent, and also help grow our economy. So I think this is a situation in this case where, because a housing voucher, you keep paying every year in order to provide the difference between what people have as income and what the rent is, and we, that's necessary in plenty of cases. But where you can help someone who's newly arrived get a job and get on their feet so that then they can pay their own rent without a housing voucher, that's very cost efficient. It's just a one-time assistance. And if we can scale that up, I think a lot of new arrivals will be able to take advantage of that service and then get on their feet, move out of shelter without a housing voucher.
So, New York City Comptroller, the Honorable Brad Lander, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us, and we look forward to having you back again on People, Power, and Politics.
It's always good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
People, Power, and Politics. Hard talk, riveting interviews, community updates, in-depth analysis. That's People, Power, and Politics. We tell it to you as it is. No holds barred. You are the people, you have the power. We bring you the politics. To listen to our show, be a guest, or to advertise, visit www.pppradio.nyc. That's www.pppradio.nyc.